Tools and Means. Written and read by John Miro. Episode 7. Claire felt like a fool chasing the fat man down a hotel hallway. The man was nodding in agreement with everything she said. Yes, he believed her research would make a difference to his constituents. Yes, of course, he saw the financial benefit from her proven regime of therapy. Oh, yes, without a doubt, and surely, and Claire wanted to scream. By then they had arrived at his door. He waved the card and passed inside. Claire stood in the doorway. A chill ran down her spine. What the hell was the matter with her, she wondered, watching Newell slip out of his shoes and grab the carafe from a black plastic coffee maker. He walked back towards her and then deked to her right into the outer part of the bathroom to slap on a faucet in the sink. "Close the door, Doctor," Newell said, affecting a lower-class accent with mushy consonants. "You're letting in the flies." Then he let out a booming laugh, as if this was the funniest thing he'd heard all night. It was a maneuver she guessed was calibrated to engender trust and relax cautious people. She'd heard him use that trick twice that night already. Claire thought about turning around and leaving. What was the use if he was as drunk as he was letting on? Now, why had her brain put it that way, she wondered. What was wrong with her? This wasn't an angry inmate. This was an Illinois senator who wanted to up his odds of re-election with her reputation, not one of the predators in lockdown. She smiled at him. It felt forced. It was forced. She didn't care for George Newell. But she didn't have to like him, just impress him. Claire stepped in, turned and closed the door. She leaned against the door and closed her eyes. Focus, Claire. Win this one for Dad, so someone else won't lose theirs. I hope I don't seem ungrateful pressing you like this, Senator. It's just, my program means so much to me. She took a deep breath, donned her most winning smile, and turned into the room. The senator stood there just a few feet away, grinning wide. In his hand was the coffee carafe. She noticed the carafe wasn't full of water from the sink, but still empty. Why? She lost track of her words. Somewhere in her brain, warning bells were going off. As George Newell raised the carafe into the air and hammered it down into the side of her head. On the 18th floor, Tom jogged to the stairs at the end and ran back down to the 17th. He took the stairs 3 at a time, cracked the door open, and caught Dr. Romer there in the hall, squeezing her hands nervously as the senator disappeared ahead of her into a room. He watched her wring her hands together one more time, and then stepped through the open door. Tom covered the distance, but not before the door to 1712 clicked shut. He looked around. The floor was empty. He risked staying a moment longer to think. He ran a hand through his short-cropped hair. "What are you doing? What are you doing?" his mind asked on a loop. George Newell was no simple politician on a junket at the taxpayer's expense. The man's whole body language had changed when he tailed him to the meeting on the bridge, and it had changed again tonight as he had lured the woman to his room. He meant her harm. Tom knew it. But what could he do? He was here to kill the man, not play a hero. He had too much to lose for that. He heard Newell's booming laugh behind the door and feared for Dr. Romer. Another woman was going to be hurt. Another woman just like... A shape a few doors away caught Tom's eyes, and he gasped. It was Allie. Her phantom hid behind a tall planter across the hall from the elevator, her face white, her lips pulled back in terror. The same look he saw on her face back then, at home. He remembered lying on the floor in his room, sobbing. He remembered staring through swollen, almost shut eyes as Bob walked into Allie's room across the hall. Remembered the way he laughed as he unbuckled his belt. "You're gonna love this, baby," The monster had laughed as he reached out to close the door, and Tom watched the horror build on his sister's face. Another woman was going to end up like you, he thought. Just like you. A shiver rode down his spine. He imagined it was his body reminding him he did not control this setting. He could not predict what Newell was doing. He was not prepared for this. What do you expect me to do? Everything he did to balance the scales, he did with meticulous planning, not like this. Allie needed him. He couldn't risk what would happen if he was caught. No. He took a step away from the door. I'm sorry, Dr. Romer. I really am. Behind the door, the woman screamed. Just as suddenly, the scream was silenced. Tom snarled. Somewhere in the back of his head, his thinking mind warned him to stop, but the fire, the rage, burned brighter than the reason. He put a hand on the door, locked. He raised both fists and just barely resisted the urge to hurl himself at the door. He looked at the metal plating around the lock. It was solid. He snarled again and charged down the hall to the elevator. Allie was there before him, hands urging him to move faster, as he shouldered the planter with a grunt and ran back to 1712. He spun his body when he was close, using the momentum of his run to bring the planter down against the lock like a battering ram. Metal squealed and the door tore open. Tom staggered forward, letting the shattered pieces of the planter fall, and saw the woman on her hands and knees in front of a bed. She was stunned, her eyes glassy, unseeing. George stood in front of her, one fist tugging her face up by her hair. The other hand held a metal ball in an open palm, a metal ball that glowed blue. Tom poured more energy into his forward momentum, ran ahead, and tackled the senator. They flung over the bed and landed in a heap. Tom slammed his fists into the fat old man, holding nothing back as he battered the politician. But George Newell didn't respond like an overweight older man. There was no hesitation or sluggishness in the way he deflected the blows, twisted his body, and flung Tom head first into the air-conditioning unit below the window. The air-conditioning unit rang. Tom saw black spots, but sprang to his feet, got his hands up to defend himself, and took a hard fist on his forearm that had been meant for his head. Tom grabbed the lapels of the senator's shirt and pulled him forward. He smashed his head into George's face. The nose exploded. But George's eyes did not tear up. His hands did not stop their attack. Tom scrambled to rise, but his opponent rose with him, smashed him back against the window, and thrust a forearm against his throat. The back of Tom's head hit the glass, and more spots chewed up his narrow vision. Then, with a gurgle, the senator let go and staggered backwards. His right arm reached across his body and clutched his left. His legs gave out, and he sagged back against the bed, panting heavily. Tom's throat burned, and he sucked in long, ragged gasps. He struggled to his knees, clearing his head, and watched as George's lips wriggled wordlessly. It was a heart attack. Must be. Tom's lips pulled back from his teeth, and he fought his way back to his feet. He felt in the back pocket for the jackknife and pulled it free. No way George Newell was going to fall down on his own. No, Tom would not be robbed. He staggered to the bed, pushed George back, and slapped one hand on his neck. He pressed his forehead against the man's, felt the slick sweat and the stink of him, and laughed up close. Don't go yet, George, Tom rasped, and raised his knife to slit through the wattles at the neck. Not 2 inches away from his own, George's eyes narrowed and stared back. A pressure grew against Tom's skin. It bloomed quickly from a tickle to a shove, and suddenly he was flying through the air. Something slammed him back against the window and pushed him higher until his feet were twitching in midair. George Newell stared at him. The muscles on his face rippled. "Damn this meat skin," he slurred, and stood up. He gained control of his breathing too quickly for a man of his size after the exertion of the fight, let alone the heart attack Tom had thought for sure he'd been having. His face craned sideways, staring at Tom like a confused dog. He gave Tom an up-and-down look, then crossed the room to step over Dr. Romer's moaning form and close his mangled hotel room door. Tom gurgled. He flailed helplessly. More of his vision turned black. And then Bob was leaning against the room's far wall. His arms folded across his chest. He shook his head. "Disappointing performance, Tommy boy," he rasped. Then George stood before the lady doctor again, palm outstretched, the giant glowing ball bearing in his cupped hand. He kicked the woman hard, turning her over, and revealed Allie's face, pleading up at Tom. "No!" It was no scream that emerged. His lips barely parted, barely gave slurring life to the white-hot rage exploding deep within. "No!" he screamed again as George circled around the woman on the ground. "Claire? No. Allie? He didn't know." Bob, inside his head, began to laugh. Tom's body writhed. Something cracked in his left shoulder as he resisted, but he didn't feel it. He kicked at the wall again and again. His fists hammered the hard plaster beneath them. George turned and looked at him, his face a blank, devoid of emotion, of understanding, as Tom struggled harder. "Don't touch!" The weight pinning his chest back doubled, and he felt something in his chest give way. He struggled harder, every cell in his body shaking. "Don't!" Across the room, Bob laughed. "Don't you laugh!" Tom snarled at the phantom. George's head turned like a dog's again, and his eyes narrowed. He looked back across the room, where Tom saw Bob, then came closer to Tom, and pushed one chubby hand under his chin. Tom's body jerked at the touch. It felt like an electric shock pouring into him from George's hand. His head exploded in pain, and George turned to stare where Tom saw Bob laughing. "You're diseased!" George looked back to Tom, his lips pulled back in profound distaste. "Broken!" Bob had stopped laughing and stared stupidly now at Tom's new tormentor. George's face changed. The features blurred, and Tom froze in terror as the fat old man became Bob. "You didn't see that coming, did you?" George said in Bob's voice. George, now Bob, stared down at Allie and back to Tom. He pinched at the brim of the vile black cap that was suddenly on his head, pinched with cigarette-yellow thumb and forefinger, and wiggled the cap once, tauntingly. Then his eyes went back down to Allie, his feast, and he licked his lips. "Been a long time." George, now Bob, walked to her side and began to laugh. The half-gasp, half-laugh he'd made every time he'd sauntered down the hall towards the back of the house, towards Allie's room. Tom writhed helplessly on the wall as the familiar figure knelt over the unconscious woman on the floor. His mouth twisted, deformed with his terror, as he tried again to scream, and failed. You have been listening to Tools and Means. Title music, Infiltrate This, by Atlas Plug, used with permission. For show notes, more information, and other fiction by me, John Muro, please visit servingworlds.com. Thank you for listening.